Shock warning. The following contains descriptions of a child's disappearance which may be distressing. In the quiet town of Havenwood, nestled under the shadow of ancient pines, just hours ago, the life of Detective Miles Corbin fractured. His daughter, Sarah, only 10 years old, vanished from their home, a place that had always felt like an unbreakable sanctuary. Everyone, in those first terrifying moments, clung to the desperate hope that she was simply playing hide-and-seek, maybe wandered to a neighbor's, or was just late coming in from the yard. It had to be a simple explanation, until the front door stood ajar, undisturbed by the wind, and the house felt unnaturally silent, the untouched plate of dinner sitting cold on the table. This wasn't just late. This was wrong. The chilling emptiness of her room, her favorite teddy bear still on the pillow, promised a truth far darker than any parent could bear, revealing evidence that this was no childish prank or simple delay. Before we get started, don't forget to subscribe if you believe that family should always come first. The stillness of Havenwood, usually a balm to Miles Corbin's soul, felt like a suffocating shroud that evening. Miles, a detective whose life had been dedicated to solving the town's small-scale dramas, now found himself starring in a nightmare he couldn't wake from. The familiar lines of their modest two-story home, normally radiating warmth, seemed stark and foreign in the fading twilight. He pictured Sarah just hours ago, her bright laughter echoing through the rooms as she sketched dragons at the kitchen table, her small hands smudged with pencil lead. Just minutes ago, he thought, his mind scrambling, she was right here. He remembered the way the setting sun caught her hair through the window, a flash of gold he often paused just to watch. That image, vivid and achingly recent, became a sudden brutal blow. Panic, cold and sharp, sliced through the rational calm he cultivated as a detective. He called her name, first softly, then louder, his voice cracking with each repetition. "Sarah, sweetie, where are you?" The house swallowed the sound, returning only silence. He moved from room to room, a frantic, clumsy ballet of terror. The untouched stack of books on her bedside table, her half-finished glass of milk, the small red shoe kicked off carelessly by the back door. Each detail was a stab, confirming her absence. His hands trembled as he checked the small, creaking closet, then under the bed, praying illogically to find her giggling, hidden away. The quiet was wrong, so wrong. It pressed in on him, thick and heavy. This wasn't hide-and-seek. This was something else, something terrifyingly vast that had swallowed his small world whole. The faint, lingering scent of the lavender soap she used was a cruel taunt in the still air. He stumbled back to the living room, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. His eyes fell on the slightly open front door, the one cinematic detail that seemed to scream entry or exit, unsettlingly still. He knew with a certainty that ripped his gut that she hadn't left on her own, not like this. The telephone receiver felt impossibly heavy in his hand as he dialed 911, the first official step into the abyss, leaving the silent house behind for the terrifying unknown that lay just beyond the threshold. The news ripped through the quiet streets like a physical wind, tearing at the fragile peace. Within hours, the small town transformed. Pickup trucks and SUVs, usually parked neatly in driveways, now clogged the roads leading to the makeshift search headquarters at the old community center. Volunteers, hundreds of them, streamed in, their faces etched with a mixture of shock and grim determination. Maps were spread across folding tables, crisscrossed with colored markers designating search grids. Coffee brewed constantly, the bitter aroma mingling with the damp earth smell clinging to boots. Children too young to search helped tape flyers to every lamppost, store window, and traffic sign. Smiling school photos now stark against the stark white paper, begging to be seen. Local news crews arrived first, their vans parking conspicuously on the town square, followed swiftly by regional affiliates, their cameras panning across the anxious crowds. The air vibrated with unspoken questions, a low hum of fear and shared grief. At the heart of it all stood Miles Corbin. He wasn't just a father, he was the town's anchor in the storm. His face, gaunt and raw with sorrow, was everywhere. On television screens, in newspaper photos, at the head of every search party briefing. He spoke with a choked voice about his daughter, about their children, rallying the volunteers with a tireless, almost manic energy. He walked the grids himself, boots caked in mud, eyes scanning the underbrush with a fierce, relentless intensity that mirrored the town's own desperate hope. Just keep moving, he seemed to project. Just keep looking. His public persona was flawless, the grieving father turned lead investigator, driven solely by love and a desperate need for answers. This apparent dedication solidified his image in the town's collective consciousness, transforming him from a respected neighbor into a figure of tragic heroism. People looked to him, clung to his visible strength, pouring their own terror and sorrow into the collective effort he spearheaded. The initial shock heightened into a dull ache of shared trauma, punctuated by fleeting, agonizing bursts of hope whenever a search party returned, only to dissipate with each shake of the head, each empty vehicle. The woods surrounding the town became a silent, watchful entity, holding secrets the town desperately clawed for. But even in the midst of this unified front, a low murmur began to circulate, a faint dissonance beneath the chorus of concern. Something about the sheer volume of the effort, about the way Miles directed it, felt unusual. Miles sat hunched over the sprawling map tacked to his office wall, tracing routes that led nowhere. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of sunlight piercing the blinds, illuminating the weary lines around his eyes. He was a detective, a title he wore like a second skin, meticulously cultivating the image of relentless dedication. Case files lay open on his desk, their contents a constant hum of failure and unanswered questions. He'd pursued the lead about the drifter who passed through town that week, spending days cross-referencing motel registries and bus tickets, the stale smell of old paper clinging to his fingertips. Another ghost chase, a quiet voice whispered inside him, a voice he usually ignored. He'd interviewed Mrs. Gable, the local eccentric, who claimed the woods whispered secrets, nodding patiently as she described visions of flickering lights and strange symbols. His tape recorder humming dutifully. He filed it away under unsubstantiated, the phrase a comfortingly professional dismissal. Though a shard of cold unease pricked him, he pulled resources, satellite imagery that showed nothing but trees, old police logs that offered no parallel incidents, even spent hours online researching local folklore he dismissed as superstition. He remembered the interview with Liam, one of the few classmates who hadn't been on the bus that day, claiming illness. Liam's hands had trembled as he spoke of whispers, of the pressure to join the party, his eyes wide with a fear that felt too raw, too real. Miles had watched him, notebook open, jotting down harmless details about who brought what food, steering the conversation away from the palpable dread that clung to the edges of Liam's story. Too close to the fire, Miles thought then, the sudden heat in his chest making him want to recoil. He closed the notebook, a polite, final click echoing in the sterile room. Liam's fear was a dangerous thread, one that pulled too hard on secrets Miles needed buried. He marked the interview summary, "Nothing new. The lie, a bitter taste." The setting sun casts long shadows across the map, making the empty spaces in the woods look vast and hungry. He picked up a single, mud-caked button he'd kept from his initial survey of the area, a detail he hadn't logged. He turned it over and over, the small weight heavy in his palm, a silent promise of where his real focus would now turn. Years bled into decades, each one laying another layer of dust onto the initial shock, muffling the cries for answers until they were barely whispers carried on the wind through the empty streets of Oak Haven. The fervent search parties dwindled, then vanished entirely. Law enforcement files grew thick, then were boxed and relegated to high shelves, officially classified as cold cases. The faces on the missing persons posters, slowly fading under fluorescent lights or peeling away from public bulletin boards like shedding skin. Hope, once a burning flame shared by the entire community, became a private, dwindling ember, often tucked away out of sight, too painful to look at directly. But Miles was different. He maintained his vigil, a public performance of grief and tireless pursuit that everyone in town saw, though few still actively participated. He kept the old corkboard outside the sheriff's office updated, though the faded photographs tacked there seemed to age faster than the years themselves, curling at the edges like brittle leaves. The vibrant colors of lost youth turned sepia-toned under sun and rain, a poignant, silent testament to the relentless passage of time. For others, the disappearance was a tragedy, a scar the town carried, a story told in hushed tones. For Miles, it remained his life's work, a relentless current pulling him forward, even as the world around him learned to live with the absence, building new routines over the hollow space left behind. He saw the pity in their eyes, the polite nods that discouraged further conversation, the way people avoided mentioning the bus or the names. They saw a man stuck in the past, clinging to a ghost. He felt the weight of their collective grief pressing down, the town's persistent shadow mirroring the one that clung to his own soul. The silence on anniversary nights was deafening, louder than any crowd had ever been. As another autumn faded, leaving the air crisp and carrying the scent of decay, Miles stood alone by the riverbank where they'd often gathered, watching the water flow ceaselessly. The public fight was over for everyone else, but the private one had just begun its deeper, darker phase, pulling him towards forgotten corners and buried truths. Retired Detective Ray Miller sat at the worn oak desk, the afternoon sun slanting through the dusty blinds of the cold case division office, illuminating floating motes in the heavy air. Before him lay the Vanishing Pines file, a case he remembered only from the hushed whispers and the way it seemed to scar everyone it touched, Miles included. He'd picked it up almost on impulse, a way to fill the quiet hours, expecting closure, perhaps a simple confirmation that every angle had been covered in the frantic days that followed. The case file itself felt weighty, not just in paper, but in sorrow. He opened the first binder, the smell of old paper and stale coffee rising faintly. Photos of smiling teenagers, now eternally frozen in time, looked up at him, a knot tightening in his chest. He skimmed through the initial reports, Miles's neat handwriting filling many pages. Soon, though, a subtle current of unease began to ripple beneath the surface of the official narrative. There was Sergeant Davies' witness statement, buried deep in the file, mentioning a second, unfamiliar vehicle parked near the bus route that morning, a detail seemingly dismissed without follow-up. Then, a cryptic note about unusual tracks near the embankment, marked animal, but with no clear photographic evidence or expert assessment. A piece of fabric, found snagged on a branch, tested, but results noted vaguely as inconclusive, tucked away without further inquiry. Ray ran a thumb over the edge of a page, a frown deepening on his face. It wasn't negligence exactly, but a pattern of leads either glossed over or abruptly abandoned. His gut, honed over decades of police work, began to twist. He recalled how Miles had seemed almost aggressively certain about the tragic accident theory early on, shutting down alternative ideas. It had felt like conviction then, born of shock and grief. Now, reviewing it years removed, it felt forced. He flipped back to the initial search logs, his eyes catching on a specific grid section marked cleared with unusual haste. The sunbeam shifted, catching the faded ink, highlighting the note, and in that moment, Ray felt a cold certainty settle over him. Something vital had been overlooked, or perhaps deliberately avoided, right at the start of Miles's investigation. He made a note to revisit that specific area, a sudden, sharp curiosity replacing the initial detachment. Detective Maria Rossi sat at her desk late, the harsh overhead fluorescence buzzing faintly, casting long, stark shadows across the reports piled before her. She reread Miles' summation of the Hallowell case, her brow furrowed, a knot tightening in her stomach. Miles, her partner, the man she'd stood shoulder to shoulder with through countless late nights and gruesome scenes. The one who'd crack jokes to ease the tension after they'd found the Miller kid all those years ago. A memory that surfaced unbidden, sharp with the metallic scent of stale coffee and the quiet relief in Miles's eyes that they'd brought closure. That was the Miles she knew. But the narrative here felt forced, too neat. Like corners had been aggressively rounded off. She traced a finger along a paragraph detailing the sudden, inexplicable disappearance, Miles's phrasing echoing the official line they'd fed the press for weeks. It felt like a deliberate avoidance, a practiced evasion. A wave of nausea rolled through her. Was she being paranoid? Miles was good, one of the best. He had a knack for seeing patterns nobody else did. Yet the nagging inconsistencies, small at first, now felt like gaping holes, demanding to be filled. She stood, pacing the small confines of her office, the floorboards creaking softly under her weight. The air felt thick with unspoken questions. Respect for Miles warred with the cold, unyielding pursuit of truth that had driven her for 20 years. She looked at the case files again, a stack of beige folders sitting innocuously on her desk, but now seeming to pulse with hidden secrets. The silence of the office, usually a comfort, pressed in on her, amplifying the doubt growing within. She paused by the window, looking out at the rain-slicked city streets, reflecting the neon glow of distant signs. Miles had seemed different since the Hallowell discovery. Distant, agitated. He brushed off her concerns with tight smiles and quick changes of subject. It wasn't just the stress of the case. It was something specific, something coiled beneath the surface. He knows more than he's telling. The thought solidified, sharp and unwelcome. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of her dawning realization, Maria turned back to her desk. Her hand hovered over the Hallowell box, then reached for a different set of folders. Older ones, cold cases from the surrounding area, from years past. If Miles was hiding something, the truth wouldn't be found by looking only where he pointed. She needed to look elsewhere, quietly, starting with what came before. The air in town had changed, subtle as the shift in season, but just as inescapable. No longer did people lower their voices only out of respect for the dead. Now, they lowered them when Miles passed. Whispers curled like smoke around corners, clinging to the stale smell of damp wood and old coffee in the diner booths. Officer Miller, sitting with his lukewarm mug, caught snippets, a hesitant, he always was a quiet one, wasn't he? Followed by a swift, guilty silence when his gaze flicked towards the door. Miles, the solitary survivor, the one spared by incomprehensible tragedy, was slowly, reluctantly, becoming something else in the town's collective eye. An enigma, a question mark draped in grief. Inside the station, the shift was less about gossip and more about the heavy weight of unspoken possibilities. Folders on the old case, untouched for decades, lay open again on Detective Reyes's desk. The crisp lines of initial reports now seemed faded, porous, full of ignored gaps. Reyes found himself staring at Miles's original statement, not with sympathy, but with a clinical, unnerving detachment, searching for tremors in the words, inconsistencies he'd once dismissed as shock. He remembered Miles, pale and shaking back then, recounting the horror, a picture of raw terror. But the mind, Reyes knew, could play tricks or be a master deceiver. He ran a finger over the typed lines, a profound unease settling deep in his gut. It wasn't just his own growing suspicion. He saw it in the brief, sharp exchanges with Miller, the way they both hesitated before mentioning Miles's name, the unspoken understanding that the accident theory, once bedrock, was now crumbling dust. A chilling memory surfaced. Miles, not long after the event, staring at a distant point, his expression not just sad, but almost calculating. It was a fleeting image Reyes had buried, deeming it a trick of the light, a product of mass hysteria. Now, it resurfaced with terrifying clarity, a cold knot tightening in his chest. This wasn't the clean cut of unavoidable disaster anymore. This felt dirty, complicated, rooted in something deliberate and disturbingly close. The files seemed to hum with secrets, promising answers if only they looked in the right, agonizing direction. Years had bled into one another since the department had packed this corner of the building, forgotten behind a locked door and layers of administrative inertia. Dust lay thick as felt on everything, a quiet blanket over stacks of yellowing reports, defunct monitors, and cardboard boxes threatening to crumble at a touch. Alex, tasked with the unglamorous job of clearing the space, felt only the dull ache in their back and the gritty texture coating their fingertips. Each box offered the same mundane discoveries: tangled cables, broken desk organizers, and files deemed irrelevant decades ago. There was no thrill, only tedious, physical work under the flickering, indifferent fluorescent light. Shoving aside a box labeled MISC Records pre-2000, their hand brushed against something small, hard, and surprisingly heavy, nested deep beneath crumpled paper and a petrified stapler. They pulled it out, turning it over in their palm. It was a microcassette, no bigger than a matchbox, encased in faded, scuffed plastic. No label offered a clue, just the tiny, dark windows showing the tightly wound tape inside. Probably just someone's old dictation, Alex thought, ready to toss it into the e-waste bin. But something stopped them. The air in the room felt suddenly heavier, stiller. It was the kind of object that belonged utterly to the time of the case, small and analog in a digital world. A forgotten voice, perhaps? A meeting? A mundane memo? Or a treacherous thought, whispered? Something else. A cold knot formed low in their stomach. It felt significant, weighted, though logically, it was just a piece of plastic. The worn edges, the silence it held, it demanded attention. They held it up, letting the dust motes dance around it in the weak light, a tiny, silent sentinel from the past. The thoughts solidified, pushing aside weariness. What if? The need to hear what it held to pierce the silence of years became sudden and overwhelming. But the equipment to play such a thing, That was another search entirely. The sterile hum of the small tape player filled the cramped office, a stark contrast to the quiet anticipation that hung thick in the air. Detective Miller's breath hitched, a silent prayer forming on their lips, but desperate hope that this small, corroded reel, found near the bus wreck, would offer some simple, tragic explanation. A cry for help cut short, the sounds of a crash. Beside them, Detective Evans shifted, eyes fixed on the spinning reels, jaw tight with shared tension. Captain Jensen stood slightly apart, arms crossed, radiating a cautious impatience born of years of cold cases and dashed hopes. The tape hissed, static crackling like brittle leaves. Then a voice, faint but distinct, broke through. It wasn't a scream, wasn't the sound of metal rending. It was a whisper, distorted, echoing as if recorded in a vast, empty space. Miller's mind reeled. This wasn't right. The words were slow, deliberate, utterly alien to the scene they had found. "The Earth remembers," the whisper said, then a pause, filled only by the tape's mechanical whir, before adding, ... The debt is paid in silence. Shock slammed into Miller with the force of a physical blow. The air left their lungs in a rush. Evans instinctively leaned forward, a bewildered frown deepening lines on their forehead. Captain Jensen's arms dropped, his body rigid with disbelief. Miller felt a cold dread bloom in their gut, twisting everything they thought they knew about the case. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't even a simple abduction. The words weren't pleading or fearful. They were pronouncements, cryptic and chilling, hinting at something ancient, something deliberate, something horrifyingly other. The sterile office seemed to warp, the mundane tape player suddenly a conduit to an unimaginable darkness. A single bead of sweat traced a path down Miller's temple. They glanced at Evans, seeing their own confusion and fear reflected in their partner's eyes. Captain Jensen slowly reached for the pause button, his hand shaking slightly. The silence that followed the chilling words was heavier, charged with the terrifying realization that they had stumbled into a narrative far stranger and more sinister than any of them could have conceived. They needed to understand what this meant, who was speaking, and why these terrifying phrases were linked to the lost bus and its missing students. The tape held more secrets, secrets they were now desperate and terrified to uncover. The old reel-to-reel machine whirred to life, a mechanical sigh in the hushed room. Alex, seated closest, watched the spools begin to turn, the thin magnetic ribbon unwinding, carrying secrets locked away for 2 decades. The air felt thick, charged with a terrible anticipation they had carried since the tape's discovery. Then, Miles's voice filled the space. It was younger, less weathered than the man they remembered, but undeniably his, hesitant at first, then gaining a strained, artificial composure. The first few sentences were innocuous, rambling about the days leading up to the disappearance, a familiar narrative they had all lived through. Alex felt a knot of dread tighten in his stomach, a visceral understanding that this wasn't just a record, it was a demolition. Miles spoke of the search, of the false leads, of the mounting despair that had gripped the town. He sounded convincing, heartbroken even, just as he had back then. But then, the cadence shifted. A tremor entered his voice, brief but profound. I wasn't honest, he murmured, the words dropping into the silence like stones into a deep well. About Sarah, I knew, almost from the start. The room seemed to tilt. Alex's breath hitched, eyes locked on the turning reels. Knew what? The question screamed in his mind, a horrifying echo of every sleepless night. Miles continued, his voice becoming flatter now, devoid of inflection, as if reciting a script of his own damnation. He detailed the hours immediately after they'd separated, the specific location where he found her, already gone. He described the panic, the irrational decision to leave her there, to run, to pretend he hadn't seen, hadn't known. Then came the confession that shattered everything. He had actively participated in the agonizing, fruitless search, watching them look for her body while he knew exactly where it lay, buried beneath leaves and time. Alex remembered Miles, wet-eyed and weary, helping tack up posters, offering condolences to Sarah's parents. That memory, sharp and cruel, twisted in his gut. It wasn't just an accident Miles had witnessed. It was a fate he had concealed, prolonging their agony year after year with a lie woven into the very fabric of their grief. The psychological horror of it was a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs. He wasn't just a witness. He was a collaborator in their prolonged suffering. A shadow fell over the tape player as someone shifted, unable to bear the weight of the sound any longer. Miles's voice continued its terrible monotone, hinting at why he had been so desperate to keep it a secret, mentioning something they found just before everything went wrong. The room went silent, the low hum of the precinct's fluorescent lights suddenly deafening. On the small monitor, the playback sputtered to a stop, leaving only the echo of Miles's calm, clinical voice hanging in the air. It wasn't just a confession. It was a dismantling of everything they thought they knew, a deliberate, painstaking lie woven into the fabric of their department for decades. Detective Miller stared at the screen, his breath catching in his throat, unable to reconcile the familiar face of his mentor, the man who taught him how to knot a tie, with the chilling detachment in the voice on the tape. Disbelief warred with a cold, heavy dread that settled deep in his gut. Around him, colleagues sat frozen, faces pale, reflecting back the same dawning horror. Officer Hayes ran a shaking hand through her short hair, her eyes wide and vacant. The sound of Miles detailing his twisted logic, his reasons, replaying like a corrupted loop in her mind. He hadn't sounded remorseful, only matter-of-fact, like explaining a particularly intricate filing system. It was the utter lack of humanity in his own words that was the most sickening betrayal, revealing a void where they had seen a leader, a friend. Miller's hands clenched into fists on his desk, knuckles white. How could they have missed it? The years of trusting him, relying on his guidance, felt like a cruel joke played on the ghosts of the missing. The air in the room grew thick with unspoken grief and simmering anger, the scent of stale coffee suddenly replaced by something metallic and acrid. This wasn't just a solved case. It was an open wound, a revelation so profound it cracked the foundation of their world, leaving them adrift in a horrifying new reality where the monster had been hiding in plain sight, wearing a badge. They had to understand the depths of this darkness, had to face the man behind the lie, before the weight of it crushed them all. The air in Miles Corbin's sterile office hung thick with unspoken accusations, a suffocating weight pressing down on us. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of afternoon light slicing through the blinds, highlighting the unnatural stillness that had fallen between us. We stood across his large, polished desk, our figures rigid, eyes locked on his. He sat back, feigning a practiced calm, his hands clasped loosely before him, but the slight tremor in his fingertips gave him away to our now sharpened gaze. This wasn't the confident, reassuring mentor we had trusted implicitly for so long. This was clearly a man cornered, the carefully constructed facade cracking under the pressure. Every ticking second of the grandfather clock in the corner seemed to amplify the silence, a relentless hammer against the taut wire of our tension, ready to snap. A strange, detached part of my mind noted the framed photos on his wall, smiling faces of past colleagues, the very definition of loyalty. Ghosts of a trust we had believed he shared. It felt like a cruel, twisted joke now, seeing them there, as his carefully constructed world began to crumble before our eyes. Slowly, deliberately, I placed the worn cassette recorder on the desk between us. The small, gray plastic box looked utterly insignificant, utterly mundane, yet it held the undeniable weight of years of calculated deception, the proof we had painstakingly uncovered. His eyes flickered down to it, then back up to mine, a carefully constructed mask of polite, almost bored confusion still clinging stubbornly to his features. "What exactly is this?" he asked, his voice smooth, entirely too smooth, a practiced performance that grated on our raw, exposed nerves. "You know what it is, Miles." Emily's voice was low, thick with the raw pain of betrayed faith, stripped bare of its usual warmth. I pressed play, the cheap plastic word to life, a mechanical heartbeat in the silent room. Then Miles's own voice filled the space, cold and clinical, discussing our project, our discoveries, our vulnerabilities, revealing strategies and selling them piece by piece to someone else entirely. His face, initially a picture of controlled curiosity, began to crumble around the edges as his own words, damning him, echoed back from the small speaker. The feigned confusion melted away like ice in a furnace, replaced by a flash of something ugly. Not outright denial, not shame, but a chilling, calculated acceptance of being caught. He didn't leap up in outrage, didn't stammer desperate explanations, didn't plead for understanding or mercy. He simply sat there, utterly still. Listening to the damning playback, his gaze fixed on the whirring reels, his jaw tight with contained fury and something else. Resignation? Calculation? When the recording ended, the silence returned, heavier, colder, more absolute than before. He didn't speak immediately. He just sat there, the true Miles Corbin finally unveiled, stripped bare of the mentor's guise we had known. The man who had guided us, encouraged us, who we had looked up to, had been systematically undermining us the entire time, selling us out for profit or power, or some unseen gain. It wasn't a single moment of weakness, a desperate mistake, or a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate, calculated act of profound, gut-wrenching betrayal, laid bare by his own dispassionate words. The realization hit like a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. "Why, Miles?" I managed, the question a choked whisper that barely broke the silence. Desperate for some logic, some reason, anything less monstrous than what the tape implied. His eyes met mine, devoid of warmth, colder than I had ever seen them, like looking into polished stone or the black void of space. "Business," he stated flatly, the single word a final, crushing blow, extinguishing the last flicker of hope for an explanation, a misunderstanding, anything less devastatingly simple and cruel than the truth. He offered no justification, no apology, no visible regret, only that chilling pragmatic motive that reduced years of trust and collaboration to a mere transaction in his twisted ledger. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed to hum and buzz louder in the desolate aftermath, casting harsh, unforgiving shadows on his suddenly unfamiliar, utterly alien face. He leaned back again, the tremor gone, replaced by an unnerving, almost defiant composure. "So," he said, breaking the thick silence with unexpected calm, his voice regaining some of its earlier smoothness. "What happens now?" The question hung in the air, not one of fear, but of strategic assessment. A clear shift from being caught to planning his next move. This was the pivot point, the line drawn in the sand. The immediate confrontation was over, the betrayal confirmed beyond doubt. But the consequences were clearly just beginning to unfold. His gaze drifted past us, towards the office door, a silent indication of where his thoughts and perhaps his immediate strategic plans were already heading. We had uncovered his secret, exposed his deception, but he seemed less concerned with being exposed and more with calculating his path forward, leaving us standing there, reeling in the desolate aftermath of his unveiled treachery, the future hanging precariously in the balance. The cold settled deep within him, a mirror of the dread that had been his constant companion for 25 years. Miles shifted, the worn wood of the chair pressing into his back, as the words, his own words from the tape or his confession, echoed in the quiet room, laying bare the reason why. It wasn't malice, he explained, not intent to harm, but a split-second decision born of sheer, unadulterated panic. He saw it again, vivid as yesterday. The sudden, terrible shock of the accident. It had been a childish dare, a moment of reckless teenage foolishness near the old creek bed, a place they shouldn't have been. Sarah, laughing one moment, had stumbled, a sickening sound swallowed by the rush of water and the snap of breaking branches. His breath hitched recalling it. The image burned behind his eyes, the fleeting glimpse of her face, then nothing but the churning water below. Fear, sharp and visceral, had seized him, squeezing the air from his lungs. He wasn't alone, not exactly, but in that instant, the crushing weight of potential consequences, parents, police, jail, felt entirely his. The thought, terrible and irresistible, had flashed. If no one knew exactly what happened, if she simply vanished. The woods had felt vast and silent then, a willing accomplice to the lie forming in his terrified mind. That initial, desperate choice to turn away, to feign ignorance, had been a tiny seed of deceit that blossomed into a monstrous, all-consuming vine, wrapping around his life, suffocating every attempt at truth. He remembered the way his hands shook, not from cold, but from the tremors of a lie already solidifying, the taste of creek water and fear on his tongue. 25 years he'd carried that secret, the weight of it pressing down until it felt less like a lie and more like the concrete foundation of his very existence. It wasn't about hating Sarah. It was about failing her completely and then burying that failure beneath layers of carefully constructed normalcy. Each passing year making the confession more impossible, the abyss between his reality and the truth ever wider. He closed his eyes, seeing not Sarah, but the empty space where she should have been, a void he had created the moment he chose silence over consequence, leaving only the haunting echo of that single, fatal stumble near the water's edge. The town square, usually a quiet collection of weathered brick and sleepy storefronts, became a buzzing hive overnight, choked with satellite trucks and reporters jostling for space. She stood on the periphery of the growing crowd, near the War Memorial, where dust still settled on faded names, and watched the spectacle unfold. Harsh camera lights bleached the familiar facades, turning neighbors' faces into pale, anxious masks projected onto flickering screens in living rooms miles away. A knot tightened in her stomach, a feeling akin to watching a wound being ripped open in slow motion. But this time, everyone could see it. News anchors spoke in hushed, grave tones, articulating the unthinkable details that had lived only in whispers and nightmares for decades. The words, uncovered, evidence, ritual, arrests, hung in the air like poison. Anger rippled through the gathering, a palpable wave that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. She saw Mrs. Gable, whose daughter used to braid her hair, pound a fist against her chest, her face contorted in silent agony. Old man Hemlock, who ran the hardware store and always had a kind word, stood frozen, his eyes wide and wet behind his thick glasses. Grief, long buried beneath layers of resignation and forced normalcy, clawed its way to the surface, sharper and more agonizing now that the source was revealed to be so monstrously human. A woman's keening cry cut through the murmur of voices, a sound so primal it made her own throat ache with sympathetic pain. This public unraveling was validation. Yes, a grim satisfaction washing over the years of doubt and silent accusation. But it was also a fresh wave of sorrow, amplified by the collective pain. She felt a fragile flicker of hope ignite in the pit of her stomach, a desperate belief that justice, however slow and imperfect, was finally possible. Police tape, stark yellow against the morning sun, stretched across the entrance to the old courthouse, a stark visual promise of the legal storm about to break. The air, thick with the scent of cheap coffee and bewildered fear, seemed to vibrate with the unspoken questions everyone carried. Who else knew? And what horrors would the courtroom walls reveal next? Following the coordinates, painstakingly extracted from the warped confession tape, a small team, led by the weary but resolute investigator, Detective Miller, pushed through thick undergrowth, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and pine. Every snapping twig, every unseen bird call felt like a violation of a long-held secret. Miller's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the oppressive silence of the forest. This was it, the spot Miles had described with chilling clarity, a place forgotten by the world, but seared into his memory. Could it truly be here? After all this time? They fanned out, their boots crushing fallen leaves, eyes scanning the uneven ground, searching for any sign, disturbed soil, a forgotten marker, anything out of place in nature's reclaiming embrace. Hours bled into one another, the initial nervous energy giving way to a quiet, desperate hope. Then a shout, hushed but urgent, pierced the stillness. One of the forensic specialists knelt by a cluster of moss-covered rocks, pointing. "Here, look!" Miller dropped beside him, his breath catching. Partially obscured by debris, something unnatural emerged from the soil. A small, faded piece of plaid fabric, a pattern tragically familiar from old yearbook photos, clutched tightly in a skeletal hand. A wave of nausea rolled through Miller, swiftly followed by a profound, crushing sorrow. This wasn't just evidence. This was Sarah. Her quiet strength, her hopeful smile from decades ago, flashed behind his eyes. The air grew heavy, thick with the weight of discovered truth. He looked up at the dense canopy overhead, a sliver of pale sunlight piercing the leaves, landing exactly on the unearthed hand, a final, devastating embrace of light after so many years in darkness. This desolate spot, described in a killer's cold words, was her final, unwanted home. The confirmation hung in the air, a heavy shroud settling over the clearing. She was here all along. The grim discovery brought a chilling sense of finality, but also a different kind of beginning, the painstaking, necessary process of bringing Sarah home and understanding fully the monstrous truth that had kept her here. The years had stacked like fallen leaves, each one adding another layer of dust and silence to the memory of that day. He sat by the window, the weak afternoon sun warming his skin, a gentle contrast to the cold knot that had resided in his gut for decades. The truth, finally unearthed from beneath layers of intentional deceit and buried fear, felt less like a triumphant revelation and more like a quiet, heavy weight settling onto weary shoulders. It was the legacy of a lie, a stark lesson in how easily truth could be twisted, hidden, and forgotten, not just by villains, but by a community's shared desire for comfort over confronting darkness. Yet there was another legacy too, the quiet persistence of those who refused to let the shadows win. He thought of the worn files, the late nights, the tiny, almost invisible threads they had followed through years of dead ends. Their dedication, a fragile flame against the encroaching night, felt like the most profound lesson of all. The emotional satisfaction, long yearned for, wasn't the explosive joy he might once have imagined. It was a deep, resonant calm, like the last note of a sad song fading into silence. The sound of birdsong from the garden outside seemed sharper now, no longer competing with the internal din of unanswered questions. He closed his eyes, feeling the truth, raw and painful as it was, settle within him, bringing with it a sense of profound, undeniable closure. It was over. The long search had ended, not in fireworks, but in a quiet, sun-drenched room, leaving behind the enduring, if sober, hope that even the deepest buried truth would eventually find its way to the light. The old wooden desk before him, covered in the papers that told the final story, seemed to hum with the quiet power of resolution. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the room, painting the walls in hues of orange and gray. A weariness settled deep in his bones, not just physical, but soul deep. There was no triumph, no exultation, only the muted hum of an ordeal past. He felt a tangle of emotions, a lingering sorrow for the lost years, a quiet ache for those who never saw this day, and a hollowed-out exhaustion that permeated everything. The burden of the unknown was lifted, yes, but it was replaced by the weight of knowing, a different kind of heavy. He ran a hand over the rough wood of the windowsill, the texture grounding him. Outside, the wind whispered through the leaves. A mournful, consistent sound. There was no grand ending, just this quiet continuation, the world moving on. He wasn't fixed, the pain wasn't gone. But it was different now, spread thinner, less acute. He pushed himself slowly from the chair, his joints protesting. The room was growing dim, the details blurring. He walked towards the door, his steps slow, deliberate. The handle was cool under his touch. Opening it, he didn't step into bright sunlight or cheering crowds. He stepped into the quiet hallway of his own home, the mundane reality a stark contrast to the decades of drama. But standing there, the ordinary light spilling from within onto the polished wooden floor felt like a silent, small promise. It was just a doorway, unremarkable in itself, but it was open,